He considered his shop to be the perfect cover. But the broken steps revealed a secret he had no idea about. Now everything has changed. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The shop on the corner had always been a small point of pride for Richard and Emma Lawrence. To passers-by, it looked like nothing more than a modest family business, its sun-bleached sign swaying slightly in the breeze, the baskets of oranges and apples stacked neatly on the front steps like an invitation to a simpler time. Every morning the smell of freshly cut fruit and the low hum of the coolers greeted regulars who stopped in before work, their voices filling the narrow aisles as they chatted with Emma while she arranged new stock. It was the kind of place neighbors trusted, a fixture in a quiet street where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. To the outside world, the Lawrences were the very picture of small-town honesty, hard-working and content. But behind the clean counters and chalkboard price signs, behind the casual smiles and neighborly nods, Richard and Emma ran something far more lucrative than a fruit and vegetable shop. The store was a front, a carefully constructed facade for an operation that had taken them years to perfect. Money flowed through the register in sums far too large for such a small business to earn, slipping from digital ledgers into offshore accounts, converted, laundered, made clean enough for politicians, financiers, and crime bosses to use without worry. It was not a game for amateurs. Every transaction was calculated to avoid notice, every tax return a work of quiet art. For years they had played their roles flawlessly, and the business had become both their shield and their sword. Richard was the practical mind behind the operation, the one who made sure the timing of transfers matched the quiet days, who ensured that cash deposits never raised suspicion. He had an instinct for risk that had kept them safe through near misses and sudden market fluctuations. Emma was the face everyone saw, the smiling woman in an apron who remembered customers' names, who chatted about recipes, who never once seemed nervous when a police car drove slowly past the shop. Together they were seamless, a team that had built a life balanced on a secret that nobody suspected. The shop itself was old, with a wooden floor that had been polished so many times, the grain shone like rippling water. The counters had been replaced twice over the years, the paint on the door refreshed every spring, and the window displays changed often enough to keep the place feeling alive. It had character, and that character was part of the disguise. People trusted what felt familiar, and Richard understood the power of familiarity better than most. Yet even the most carefully constructed life needs maintenance, and the Lawrences had been meaning to repair the crumbling steps outside the shop for months. They had been patched and repatched, but the concrete had begun to crack along the edges, one corner sagging just enough to make Emma worry that an older customer might trip. They wanted the entrance to look welcoming, safe, solid, a place where no one would imagine that behind the counter ran numbers large enough to draw the attention of men who lived far above this quiet neighborhood. On a bright morning, when the air was thick with the smell of wet pavement from a dawn rain, Richard finally called a pair of workers to tear out the old steps. He stood outside watching as they brought sledgehammers down on the brittle concrete, the rhythmic thud echoing off the buildings. Each blow sent up small clouds of dust that settled on the baskets of fruit inside the windows, and Emma, sweeping behind the counter, tried not to mind the mess. The work went slowly. The steps had been there for decades, poured thick and stubborn. It was near noon when one of the workers pried up a large slab and shouted for Richard to take a look. Beneath the concrete, running through the packed earth like some strange black root, was a cable. Thicker than any electrical wire Richard had ever seen. It curved out of the soil, disappearing again toward the building. At first he assumed it was an old line, maybe some forgotten utility connection. But something about it looked wrong. The sheath was intact, slightly sticky with summer heat, and there were no signs of age or decay. The workers asked if they should cut it and move on, but Richard hesitated. He crouched, brushing away more dirt with his hands, following the line for several feet. The deeper he looked, the more cables he uncovered, running parallel like veins beneath the shop. A knot of unease coiled in his stomach. These weren't random. They had been placed here with purpose, routed carefully beneath the steps, and straight toward the building's foundation. He told the workers to leave it for now, that he would figure out what to do with it later. They shrugged and went back to breaking apart the other steps, but Richard's mind was no longer on the renovation. As he stood and wiped the dust from his hands, he glanced at the front of the shop, its cheerful windows and familiar awning, and felt something shift in his perception. The building looked the same as it always had, but now it seemed to hold a secret, one he had never suspected. That night, after they closed up, Emma poured them each a glass of wine and suggested they celebrate the start of the renovations. They sat together in the small back room that served as an office, the ledger open on the desk beside them, the day's numbers carefully recorded. Yet the presence of the cable weighed on them both. Emma asked if it could be dangerous, if perhaps it was live electrical wiring that had been forgotten. Richard shook his head, though he wasn't sure. He told her it was probably nothing, but even as he said the words, his mind kept circling back to the way the cables had branched under the earth, too precise to be a coincidence. Later, as they lay in bed, the house silent around them, Richard found it hard to sleep. The thought of those lines running under the floor would not leave him. He pictured them in the dark, stretching unseen beneath the shop, leading to some hidden destination. He had spent years building this business as a perfect illusion, yet now he felt as though someone might have been one step ahead of him all along, as though his life had been quietly mapped and traced without his knowing. The next morning, the steps outside the shop were gone, leaving only a pit of loose earth and broken concrete. The shop opened as usual, customers coming and going with cheerful indifference to the work site out front. But for Richard and Emma, everything had changed. Each creak of the wooden floor seemed louder, every flicker of the fluorescent lights overhead sharper. When Emma reached to switch on the radio, her hand trembled ever so slightly. For the first time since they had started their scheme, the shop no longer felt like a safe place. It felt like something watching them, holding its breath. Waiting. The comfort they had built with such care had begun to crack, and beneath it was something they could no longer ignore. Morning came, as it always did, with the faint glow of dawn creeping across the street, and the smell of wet asphalt rising from the night's rain. But Richard and Emma felt none of the easy calm that usually accompanied the start of their day. The broken steps outside the shop looked like an open wound now, the pit of dirt and fractured concrete, an ugly reminder of what they had found. When Richard unlocked the front door, the little brass bell above it jingled the way it always did, but the sound struck him as oddly loud, almost sharp, as though announcing them not to customers, but to something hidden. Emma busied herself with arranging the baskets near the entrance, stacking apples in neat pyramids, but her movements were quicker than usual, her shoulders a little too stiff. The first customers arrived just after 8. Mr. Caldwell from down the street picked through the peaches, nodding and smiling in his usual way, but Richard couldn't stop his eyes from following him as he moved about the shop. Every pause Caldwell made felt prolonged. Every glance lingered too long, even though nothing about the man's manner had changed. When he finally paid and left, Richard found himself letting out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. More customers followed, the usual morning rush, but the unease only grew. Emma found herself retreating more often to the back room, glancing through the small window at the front of the shop, as if expecting to catch someone doing something they shouldn't. By late morning, Richard's focus had drifted entirely from the register. He kept thinking of the cables buried under the earth, their black sheaths gleaming faintly in his memory. It wasn't just the fact of their existence that disturbed him. It was the orderliness of them, the way they had been arranged like arteries leading into the very heart of the building. When the foot traffic slowed, he slipped into the back, lifted the trapdoor to the basement, and descended into the dim, cool air that always smelled faintly of mildew. He had rarely spent more than a few minutes down here in the past. It was a place for storage, a place to keep old invoices and boxes of seasonal decorations. But today, he examined the space with a new intensity. His flashlight beam swept along the walls until it caught on something near the far corner. At first it looked like nothing, just a dark smudge where the concrete met the floor. But when he crouched closer, he saw it was another section of the same cable, running directly through a drilled hole. His pulse quickened. He traced it with his fingers, feeling the cold, rubbery surface, then followed it as far as he could along the wall. When Emma called down to ask what he was doing, he muttered something about checking for leaks, but he didn't come back up right away. He found another hole on the opposite wall, smaller, but with the same black line vanishing into it. There were several, he realized, all carefully cut and positioned. It was as though the basement had been wired into something larger, something that extended beyond the shop itself. When he finally returned upstairs, Emma was wiping down the counter with a cloth, her expression tight. She asked if he thought it was dangerous, and he told her he didn't know, though his mind was racing with possibilities. Old utilities wouldn't explain this. The cables looked too new, too well maintained. Someone had installed them deliberately. The day passed in a haze. The shop's familiar rhythm, customers chatting, the cooler doors opening and closing, the rustle of produce bags, felt offbeat now. Richard found himself listening too intently to every sound, as though beneath the normal noise he might hear something mechanical, something hidden. Twice he caught sight of unfamiliar faces loitering just beyond the doorway. A man with a baseball cap pretending to check his phone, a woman slowly crossing the street, as though to look into the windows. Maybe they were just passers-by, but their presence gnawed at him. That evening, after the last customer had left and the lights were dimmed, Richard returned to the basement with a small screwdriver and a pair of pliers. He began prying at one of the metal covers that had been bolted over a junction box near the floor. It took several minutes, the metal squealing softly. But when it came loose, he found a tangle of wires inside, organized far too neatly for anything that had been abandoned. There was even a small indicator light glowing faintly green. He froze, staring at it. Whatever this was, it was not dead. When he told Emma, she grew pale. They stood together in the back room, the muffled hum of the coolers filling the silence, and considered what this might mean. For years they had been careful, meticulous, certain that their operation left no trace. But what if someone had been watching all along? Not the occasional rival sniffing around, not a random auditor, but someone with the power to wire their building without their knowledge. That night was worse than the last. Richard lay awake listening to every creak of the shop below them. He imagined the cables pulsing like black veins, carrying signals to some unknown destination. Even the house felt strange, as though it had been hollowed out and filled with someone else's presence. Emma tossed and turned beside him, rising once to check the locks on the doors, though they had already been locked. Morning did not bring relief. When they opened the shop, Emma turned on the radio and kept the volume high, as if to fill the space with something louder than her thoughts. She smiled at the customers, but her eyes darted to the corners of the room, scanning for anything out of place. Richard tried to focus on the deliveries, but he found himself running through mental lists of who might want to watch them, who might benefit from having access to every transaction, every private conversation. By noon, a new kind of tension had taken root. Each person who walked through the door was a potential threat. The young man who asked too many questions about the ripeness of the avocados, the woman who lingered too long by the shelves before buying nothing. Every one of them seemed like they might be listening, observing, reporting back. Richard's chest felt tight, as if the very air of the shop had turned heavier. In the back room, they sat together in silence as the afternoon sun poured through the dusty window, casting long bars of light across the floor. The ledgers lay open, the numbers neat and precise, but for the first time Richard felt no pride in their perfection. The system that had once made him feel powerful now felt fragile. If someone had been recording them, if the cables led to storage somewhere, then every dollar they had laundered was already documented. When the sun went down and they closed the shop, they did not celebrate the end of the day the way they usually did. Instead, they stood in the empty store, listening to the faint hum of the lights overhead, and wondered whether they were standing alone at all. Richard switched off the main breaker and plunged the shop into darkness, but the sense of being observed did not go away. If anything, it felt sharper, as though the darkness only made the unseen eyes clearer. When they went upstairs that night, Emma paused on the landing and looked back down toward the shop. She had always thought of the place as a kind of extension of their home, a second heartbeat that kept them safe and fed. Now it seemed like something that was breathing on its own, something that might be listening even now. And as Richard locked the door to their apartment, he knew that tomorrow he would have to go back down into the basement and dig deeper. Whatever those cables were, whatever purpose they served, he had to know where they led. The shop that had been their perfect disguise was beginning to feel like the most dangerous place in the world, and neither of them could ignore it any longer. The following days blurred into one another, not with the usual ease of routine, but with the tight, airless tension of a place under siege. Richard opened the shop each morning as he always had, keys jingling in his hand, the bell over the door announcing the start of business. But the sound no longer welcomed him. It grated. It felt like an alarm. Every creak of the wooden floor under his boots seemed to echo too loudly, as if someone, somewhere, was keeping count of every step. The shop, once his sanctuary, had grown hostile overnight. Or perhaps it had always been hostile, and he was only now beginning to notice. Emma tried to keep things running as usual. She stocked the displays, swept the floor, and smiled at the customers, but her smile had grown fixed, brittle at the edges. She had started leaving the radio on from opening until closing, music and advertisements spilling into every corner of the store to drown out what she imagined might be microphones hidden in the walls. The familiar background noise, once comforting, now seemed to mock her. When the announcer's voice filled the room, she imagined someone else listening to it at the same time, not because they cared about the music, but because they were listening to the Lawrences. Richard found himself spending more time alone at night, sitting in the basement with the flashlight turned off, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom as he listened to the hum of the equipment. The faint glow of the indicator lights cast small green halos on the wall, making the space feel alive. He could not decide if he wanted to tear the whole system apart with his bare hands or trace every cable until he found where it ended. Each night he returned upstairs with dirt under his nails and dust on his clothes, and Emma watched him with a silent question in her eyes that he could not answer. The customers began to notice something was wrong. People still came, but they lingered less, their conversations shorter. The shop had always been a place where neighbors stopped to talk about the weather, to share gossip or recipes, but now there was a heaviness in the air that sent them back into the street more quickly. One morning, Richard caught sight of a man standing across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, watching the shop. He didn't move for nearly an hour, only straightened once to light a cigarette. When Richard finally stepped outside to confront him, the man walked away without a word, vanishing down the side street as though he had been waiting only to be seen. The sense of being surrounded grew. A dark sedan appeared some mornings parked 2 blocks down. A delivery truck idled a little too long at the curb. The faces of strangers in the shop seemed to come back again and again, always buying something small, always asking polite questions about the business. Emma started keeping notes on a pad in the back room, jotting down the descriptions of people who felt wronged to her, and the list grew longer with each day. At night, the paranoia climbed higher. Richard began waking up around 2 or 3 in the morning and going downstairs, unable to sleep with the thought of the cables beneath his feet. He ripped at them with a crowbar, pulled them from the walls until they hung like black snakes across the floor. But for every length he tore out, there seemed to be more hidden behind the next panel, under the next layer of concrete. It was as though the shop was bleeding wires, and he could not staunch the flow. Emma, too, was unraveling. She stopped inviting the few friends she had for coffee in the back room. She flinched when the doorbell rang, even during business hours. Sometimes, when the shop was empty, she stood at the window and watched the street as if expecting someone to approach. She began unplugging the shop's official security cameras at night, as though they too might be feeding information to whoever had laid the hidden cables. The turning point came on a gray afternoon when a courier delivered an envelope marked with the name of a client who had been using their laundering services for months. Inside was not just a routine order, but an instruction for a transfer so large it made Richard's stomach knot. It was the kind of transaction that would light up every system they had, the kind that, if someone was truly watching, could end everything in a single moment. Refusing was dangerous. Their clients were not patient people, but accepting the job felt like walking into a trap. Emma read the note once, then set it down with shaking hands. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The shop was empty, the music from the radio tinny in the background, the clock on the wall ticking so loudly it made Richard want to smash it. They were trapped, not just by their business or their obligations, but by the walls themselves. The shop had become a cage, each shelf and counter a bar, each step on the floor another reminder that they could not escape what they had built. That night, the unease became unbearable. Richard prowled the aisles long after they had closed, running his hand along the edge of the counter, staring up at the lights, as though he might spot hidden lenses staring back. He imagined cameras behind every vent, recorders behind every wall. Emma sat at the desk in the back, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face pale. She had stopped pretending to read the ledger. The numbers meant nothing now. Outside, the street was quiet, but to Richard, it felt like eyes were watching from every darkened window, from every parked car. He stood at the front door with the lights off and stared at the reflection of the shop in the glass, seeing himself as if he were part of a display, something set out for others to observe. The building that had once felt like an extension of their home now seemed like an enemy, one that listened, recorded, and judged. When he finally returned upstairs, he found Emma sitting at the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. She didn't look up when he entered, and he realized with a sinking weight that she was as far gone into this fear as he was. They were both prisoners now, locked not by steel bars, but by the knowledge that every sound, every movement might be captured by someone they could not see. As he lay down beside her, Richard thought about the courier's envelope and the looming decision it contained. One more job, one more set of numbers to move through the system, and it might all collapse. Perhaps it had already collapsed, and they were the last to know. He closed his eyes, but the darkness did not bring rest. Instead, it brought the image of the basement, the cables, the glowing lights, pulsing like the heartbeat of something that lived beneath their feet. When the sun rose the next morning, the shop looked the same as it always did from the outside, the baskets neatly arranged, the windows wiped clean. But to Richard and Emma, the day brought no comfort. The bell above the door rang with its usual bright sound, but now it was a signal that another day inside the cage had begun. And somewhere deep inside, Richard knew that he could not endure it much longer. The shop would either destroy them or force them to take a step so drastic it would change everything. The night after the courier's envelope arrived felt endless, a stretch of silence so heavy that Richard wondered if the very air in the apartment had thickened. He lay awake, staring at the faint light from the street lamp filtering through the curtains, counting the seconds between the occasional groans of the old building, as though they might form some pattern. Beside him, Emma did not sleep either. He could feel it in the tension of her shoulders, in the way she shifted and stilled, as though each sound from below, a settling beam, the hum of the coolers, was a whisper meant only for her. By the time the first gray streaks of dawn appeared, Richard had made a decision he had been circling for days. He would find the center of the system that had turned their lives into a performance, and he would see for himself what it contained. He opened the shop as usual, turned on the lights, and went through the motions of arranging the displays, but the work felt hollow. The customers came and went, their faces blurring together. He kept looking toward the back room, toward the trap door that led to the basement, and each time the urge to open it grew stronger. When the rush of the morning ended, he told Emma to watch the front and descended the steps into the damp air below. The cables he had ripped from the walls in his midnight fits still littered the floor like dead serpents, but he ignored them, heading straight for the corner where the indicator lights had glowed so steadily. He brought tools this time, a crowbar, a set of wrenches, and set to work prying open the bolted cover that had defied him before. Sweat slicked his palms, the sound of metal against metal screeching in the confined space. When the panel finally gave way, it revealed not a tangle of obsolete wires, but a compact server unit, its casing dusted but intact, its lights blinking with a slow, steady rhythm that seemed almost alive. The sight made Richard's stomach twist. This was no leftover installation. This was current, functioning, and deliberate. He stood there for several minutes, his flashlight beam fixed on the box, listening to the faint hum it emitted. It felt as though the entire shop above was holding its breath. Finally, he forced himself to move, crouching to trace the path of the cables as they entered and exited the box. They were bundled with a precision that left no doubt. Whoever had installed this had known exactly what they were doing. It wasn't the work of a casual intruder or some lazy contractor. It was the work of a system designed to endure. When he returned upstairs, Emma took one look at him and knew something had shifted. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him into the back room, where he told her what he had found. Her face went white, and she sank into the chair behind the desk, staring at the wall as if she could see through it. The reality they had feared was no longer just suspicion. It was a fact. They were being monitored, and had been for who knew how long. For the rest of the day they worked in silence, moving mechanically through their tasks. Customers came in, bought their produce, made small talk, and left. But to Richard and Emma, each transaction felt like an act performed on stage. They no longer dared to discuss the courier's order, not even in whispers. Every time the bell over the door rang, Emma flinched. Every time the phone rang, Richard hesitated before answering, convinced he might hear a voice on the other end that already knew everything. That night, after they closed the shop, they sat together in the darkened back room with the envelope between them. The decision they had been avoiding now pressed down on them like a physical weight. To go through with the laundering order meant risking exposure if the system beneath the shop was recording everything. And if it was, there was no telling who might be watching. To refuse meant angering a client who had the power to make their disappearance look like an accident. Richard stood suddenly, unable to sit any longer, and told Emma that if they were to have any chance of taking control of their lives again, they had to do something drastic. He would dismantle the entire system, tear out the box, and destroy every cable he could find. He could see the fear in Emma's eyes, but she nodded slowly. Whatever dangers might follow, they could no longer live in this half-life, waiting for the walls to speak. They prepared quickly. Richard gathered tools and heavy gloves, while Emma pulled together the most important documents, a stash of cash, and packed them into a small duffel bag. The shop felt eerily still as they moved, as though the building itself was aware of what they were about to do. When Richard pried open the trapdoor again, the sound echoed through the silent store like a gunshot. In the basement, he worked with a fevered intensity, ripping cables from their brackets, unscrewing panels, smashing components with the crowbar. Sparks flew as wires were torn from their housings, and the green lights on the server box blinked frantically before dying altogether. The hum that had haunted him for nights ceased, leaving a silence so profound that his ears rang. When he climbed back up, breathing hard, his shirt streaked with sweat and grime, Emma was waiting by the back door. She had opened the duffel bag, ready for them to leave if it came to that. But as they stood there together, the smell of dust and scorched plastic rising from the basement, they both knew that simply destroying the system might not be enough. Whoever had installed it would come looking when the feed went dark. Richard's mind raced. They could run tonight, leave the shop behind, disappear into another city under new names. They had enough money stashed away to start again. But the thought of abandoning everything they had built, the shop that had been their shield and their livelihood, filled him with a cold, bitter rage. He wanted whoever had done this to know that he was not just a frightened animal scurrying into the dark. In the end, they stayed through the night, watching the street from the upstairs window. Hours passed, and though no one came, Richard felt certain that somewhere, someone had noticed. The next morning they opened the shop late. The air inside smelled faintly of burnt rubber, and the floorboards still bore the scuff marks of the previous night's battle. But to the first customer who walked in, nothing seemed amiss. Wordlessly, Richard completed the courier's order, moving the money through the channels as instructed. But he did so with a new sense of purpose. If this was a trap, he would spring it on his own terms. If someone came for them, he would be ready. Emma watched him work, her hands steady now, as though she too had made peace with the path they had chosen. When the day ended and the shop was empty again, they stood together at the front window, looking out at the street as dusk fell. The baskets of fruit glowed softly in the last light of the day, the display as inviting as ever. To anyone passing by, the shop would have looked as ordinary as it always had. But to Richard and Emma, it was no longer a refuge or a front. It was a battleground, a place they had chosen to reclaim, even if it meant inviting danger. As the first streetlights flickered on and the shadows stretched across the road, Richard locked the door and turned the sign to closed. The shop stood silent behind them, holding its secrets in its walls, but no longer holding them captive. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as prisoners, but as people who had finally looked into the dark heart of their own creation and refused to be broken by it. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too intense to keep to yourself.